Rome was not dying when Caesar was born, but it was no longer stable either. It existed in a strange in-between state, too powerful to collapse, too divided to stand still. From the outside, Rome looked like the greatest power in the world. Its legions stretched across conquered lands, its roads connected distant provinces, and its Senate still projected the image of order and tradition. But inside Rome itself, something had shifted. The Republic, once built on shared governance between elite families, assemblies, and magistrates, was beginning to fracture under the weight of its own expansion. Conquest had changed everything. Every new territory Rome absorbed brought wealth, but also inequality. Generals returned from campaigns with armies loyal to them personally, not to the state. Political offices became stepping stones for ambition rather than public service. Elections were increasingly influenced by bribery, intimidation, and factional alliances. And beneath it all, the people of Rome were changing too. The old citizen-soldier ideal, where farmers left their land, fought for Rome, and returned home, was disappearing. Long campaigns meant soldiers served for years under the same commander. Their loyalty shifted slowly but permanently away from the Senate and toward the generals who fed them, paid them, and led them to victory. This was the most dangerous transformation of all. Because once an army stops belonging to the state, it starts belonging to individuals. And Rome had already seen what that meant. The Gracchi brothers had tried to reform inequality through land redistribution. They were killed. Gaius Marius had reformed the army and opened recruitment to the poor. He changed the structure of military loyalty forever. Then came Sulla, a man who did not just fight enemies of Rome, but marched his army into Rome itself. That moment shattered an ancient boundary. The idea that Rome's internal politics could never be decided by force. Sulla broke that rule, and once broken, it could never be restored. He became dictator. He purged enemies. He rewrote political structures. And then he stepped down voluntarily, believing he had restored balance. But he hadn't restored anything. He had proven something worse. That power could be seized, and released, and seized again. By the time Sulla died, Rome was already unstable in a new way. The Republic still existed, but it was now haunted by memory of what had happened when it failed. Fear entered politics. Ambition became militarized, and trust between factions collapsed. The Senate, once the center of authority, was no longer unquestioned. It was now one power center among many, competing with generals, populist leaders, and wealthy elites. And in this unstable environment, every ambitious man in Rome began to ask the same question. Not how do I serve the Republic, but how do I control it? This was the world Julius Caesar was born into. Not a collapsing empire, not a stable republic, but a system slowly transforming into something it had never been before. A state where law existed, but power decided outcomes. A society where tradition existed, but violence determined limits. And a political world where ambition was no longer restrained by institutions strong enough to contain it. It was a world waiting for someone who understood it completely. Someone who did not fear instability, but understood how to use it. And that someone was about to be born into Rome's most dangerous century. Julius Caesar was born into a Rome that already carried the weight of its own contradictions. On the surface, his family, the Julii, claimed descent from the ancient line of Aeneas, and through him, the goddess Venus. It was a story of divine ancestry, carefully preserved by Roman elite families who understood something important about power. Legitimacy is often as important as capability. But in reality, Caesar's branch of the family was not among the most politically dominant in Rome. They were respected, yes, Old, yes, but not wealthy enough or powerful enough to guarantee dominance in the Senate's highest circles. And in Rome, respect without power was fragile. From a young age, Caesar was exposed to a world where status was constantly being negotiated. Even within aristocratic circles, alliances shifted, families rose and fell, and political survival depended on reading those shifts faster than everyone else. But his early life was not defined by privilege alone. It was defined by instability. Rome itself was unstable, and that instability reached into his personal world. When Caesar was still a teenager, his family became directly entangled in the political turbulence surrounding Sulla's rise to power. Sulla's return to Rome marked one of the most violent political purges in Roman history. Lists of enemies were posted publicly, executions followed, property was confiscated, entire networks of families were destroyed in the name of restoring order. Caesar's connection to this moment was personal. He was ordered to divorce his wife Cornelia, who was the daughter of Cinna, a political opponent of Sulla. Caesar refused. This single act placed him in immediate danger. Refusal in Sulla's Rome was not a symbolic gesture. It was defiance against a system that was actively eliminating resistance. Caesar's life suddenly became precarious. His family connections, his marriage, his political associations, all of it marked him as a potential target. At this stage, Caesar was not powerful enough to protect himself through influence alone. He had no army, no major office, no dominant faction behind him. He was vulnerable, and vulnerability in Rome during Sulla's dictatorship was often fatal. He went into hiding, moving through uncertain territory, avoiding detection, surviving in a city where political identity could determine life or death. At one point, he was reportedly captured by Sulla's forces or those acting under his authority. What followed became part of Caesar's early mythos. He was released after intervention from influential figures who saw potential in him or wished to avoid unnecessary escalation with his family. But Sulla's reaction to Caesar's survival is what mattered most. Sulla is said to have remarked that in Caesar there were many Mariuses. This was not a compliment. It was a warning. Gaius Marius had been Sulla's great rival, popular, powerful, and a symbol of the populist forces Sulla had fought against. To say Caesar contained many Mariuses was to identify him as someone who could become a future threat to the established order. And Sulla understood something crucial about Rome. Threats do not always need to be immediate. They only need to be recognized early enough to matter. Despite pressure, Caesar survived Sulla's purge. Eventually, he left Rome temporarily, joining military service in the East. This was not simply escape, it was adaptation. In Rome, exile or removal from the political center was often a necessary phase for survival and reinvention. In the East, Caesar began to develop skills that would define his later life. Military discipline, leadership under pressure, understanding of logistics, supply, and command structure. But more importantly, he learned how armies functioned as social systems, not just instruments of war, but communities built on loyalty, reward, and shared identity. This understanding would later become one of his greatest strengths. Because Caesar did not see armies as tools. He saw them as relationships. And relationships, unlike tools, could be shaped. When he eventually returned to Rome, he was no longer the vulnerable young aristocrat who had defied Sulla at great risk. He was something different. He had survived political terror. He had experienced exile. He had seen military systems from the inside. And he had learned that survival in Rome was not about avoiding danger. It was about navigating it. This shift in perspective is critical, because Caesar did not return to Rome seeking safety. He returned understanding that Rome itself was no longer safe for anyone who aimed too low. Only those willing to risk everything could control anything. And that mindset would define every decision he made from that point forward. Because in Caesar's mind, Rome was not a system to be protected. It was a system to be understood. And eventually, to be reshaped. Rome after Sulla did not feel like a restored republic. It felt like a republic that had learned fear. The dictatorship of Sulla had officially ended, but its shadow remained everywhere. His proscriptions had reshaped the political landscape so thoroughly that even after his withdrawal, the memory of what had happened continued to influence every decision made in the Senate. Families that had once dominated Roman politics were gone. Others had been elevated in their place. And everyone who remained understood a silent rule. Power once seized does not forget how it was taken. This was the Rome Julius Caesar returned to after his time away. But return is not the same as re-entry. Caesar did not step back into his old world. He stepped into a reorganized hierarchy where survival required more than lineage or ambition. It required timing, precision, and above all, awareness of which forces still held influence beneath the surface. At this stage, Caesar was no longer the vulnerable youth who had defied Sulla directly. He had gained military experience in the East, exposure to command structures, and a growing understanding of how Rome's political and military systems were becoming intertwined. But experience alone does not grant position in Rome. Influence does. So Caesar began the slow process of rebuilding his political identity, not through immediate confrontation, but through calculated visibility. He re-entered public life as an advocate, using rhetorical skill to make his presence known in legal and political disputes. In Rome, courts were not separate from politics, they were theaters of influence. Winning a case meant more than legal success. It meant reputation, recognition, and political momentum. Caesar understood this instinctively. His speaking style was not yet the refined command he would later be known for, but even early on, he demonstrated something important. Control of attention. In a city where hundreds of ambitious men competed for visibility, being heard was the first form of power. But Caesar was not only speaking. He was observing. He was learning the rhythms of Roman political life in a deeper way than most of his peers, who aligned with whom, which families were rising, which factions were weakening, where old loyalties still held and where they were already breaking. And beneath it all, one truth remained constant. Rome was still unstable. Sulla's reforms had not resolved the underlying tension between aristocratic control and popular pressure. Instead, they had suppressed it temporarily, like pressure trapped beneath a surface that had not been structurally repaired. Caesar saw this clearly. And unlike many others, he did not interpret instability as something to fear. He interpreted it as something to use. During this period, Caesar also took on roles that gradually expanded his visibility within the state. He served in religious offices, including the position of pontifex, which placed him within Rome's sacred political structure. In Rome, religion and politics were not separate spheres, they were deeply integrated systems of authority. Control of religious offices meant control of symbolism, ritual timing, and public legitimacy. Caesar understood this dimension of power as well. Not only how Rome governed itself, but how it justified that governance. At the same time, he continued building personal alliances. Roman politics was not driven solely by ideology. It was a network of obligations, debts, favors, and reciprocal advantage. A man did not rise alone. He rose through connections. And Caesar was becoming increasingly skilled at identifying which connections would matter in the long term. But even as he advanced, the memory of Sulla's terror remained present in Roman political consciousness. It shaped caution, it shaped ambition, and it shaped how quickly political conflict could escalate into violence. Everyone knew what had happened when institutions failed to contain power. So even as Caesar moved forward, he did so within a system still psychologically marked by recent trauma. Then came a moment that revealed something important about him. He was captured by pirates while traveling across the Aegean Sea. For most men, this would have been a crisis. For Caesar, it became something closer to a test of character. The pirates demanded ransom. Caesar responded not with fear, but with unusual confidence, reportedly telling them they did not understand who they had captured, and even treating them with a level of disdain that unsettled their expectations. He insisted on increasing the ransom amount himself. He joked with them. He composed speeches. He behaved not like a prisoner, but like a man temporarily inconvenienced by circumstance. And when he was released, he did not retreat or disappear. He pursued them, organized a force, captured them, and executed them. This moment matters not because of its brutality, but because of what it reveals psychologically. Caesar did not see power as fixed. He saw it as reversible, a condition that could shift depending on action, timing, and will. This mindset would define everything that followed. Because in Rome, most men adjusted themselves to circumstances. Caesar adjusted circumstances to himself. And that distinction would eventually separate him from everyone around him. As he returned again to Rome, his reputation had subtly changed. He was no longer just an ambitious aristocrat. He was becoming someone associated with decisiveness, boldness, and a willingness to act where others hesitated. And in a system where hesitation often meant loss. That quality mattered. But Rome was still not ready for him. Not yet. Because his true rise would not begin with office or rhetoric alone. It would begin when he stopped operating within Rome's existing political structure and began shaping it instead. When Julius Caesar returned to Rome after his captivity and early political learning, he came back into a city that still did not fully recognize what he was becoming. To most observers, he was another ambitious nobleman, gifted, energetic, and clearly talented in rhetoric and public life, but still operating within the expected boundaries of Roman political advancement. But Caesar was no longer thinking within those boundaries. Rome's political system, the cursus honorum, was designed to regulate ambition through structured steps: military service, financial administration, public office, and eventually higher magistracies like praetor and consul. In theory, it ensured that only experienced men reached the top. In practice, it created competition for visibility at every stage. And Caesar understood something crucial. Each stage was not just a step. It was a platform, a chance to be seen, to be remembered, to accumulate influence before formal power ever arrived. He began his ascent by deliberately engaging with public life in ways that maximized attention. Legal cases were not just legal matters, they were performances. The Roman courts functioned like public theaters where persuasion mattered as much as law. Caesar's rhetorical skill began to sharpen significantly during this period. He was not yet the dominant orator he would later become, but he possessed something equally important: clarity of persuasion combined with emotional control. He did not simply argue. He structured perception. And in Rome, perception often mattered more than truth. At the same time, Caesar aligned himself with political currents that were increasingly sensitive to the growing imbalance between elite control and popular pressure. The populace faction, though not a formal party in the modern sense, represented those who sought broader support from the people against the entrenched aristocratic dominance of the Senate's conservative elite. This alignment was not purely ideological. It was strategic, because Caesar understood that Rome's political tension was not static. It was accelerating. The Senate's authority still existed, but it was no longer unchallenged. Generals returning from campaigns held influence over armies. Wealthy individuals could shape elections. Popular leaders could bypass traditional structures by appealing directly to assemblies. The Republic was becoming multi-centered, and Caesar positioned himself within that fragmentation. One of his early major opportunities came through public office, where he began to demonstrate something that would define his career: the ability to turn administrative roles into political capital. When he served as quaestor, he gained exposure to financial systems of the state. When he served as aedile, he was responsible for public games and infrastructure. Most men treated these roles as obligations. Caesar treated them as investment opportunities. He spent heavily to fund public games, entertainments, and civic displays. To some of his contemporaries, this seemed reckless, financially dangerous, even irresponsible. But Caesar understood Roman political psychology better than most. Generosity created visibility. Visibility created loyalty. And loyalty could be converted into political momentum. He was effectively building recognition debt, people who remembered his name because they had been entertained, assisted, or influenced by his public generosity. But this came at a cost. Debt. Massive personal financial debt that would have destroyed a lesser political career. Yet Caesar did not view it as risk in the conventional sense. He viewed it as leverage. Because in Rome, debt was not just economic. It was relational. It tied individuals into networks of obligation, expectation, and future repayment. And Caesar was building those networks at scale. At the same time, his political identity became more visible. His speeches, his alliances, and his public actions increasingly placed him in contrast with more conservative elements of the Senate. Not as an open revolutionary, but as a figure willing to push boundaries that others treated as fixed. And in Rome, pushing boundaries was enough to create opposition. It was during this period that Caesar also began forming relationships that would later become structurally important to Roman politics. Alliances in Rome were not static. They were adaptive systems of mutual benefit. Men supported each other not because they agreed on ideology, but because their interests temporarily aligned. Caesar was particularly skilled at identifying these alignments. He was not simply forming friendships. He was mapping power. But even as his influence grew, he was still operating within a system that had not yet fully registered his long-term significance. That would change when he reached the next stage of his career: higher office and deeper integration into Rome's political core. Because at that level, influence was no longer local. It became structural. And once a man begins influencing structure rather than participation, he stops being just another political actor. He becomes part of the system itself, or a force capable of reshaping it. And Caesar, whether Rome realized it yet or not, was moving steadily toward the second. By the time Julius Caesar reached the threshold of Rome's highest political office, the Republic had become something paradoxical. It still functioned. Elections were still held. Laws were still passed. The Senate still debated. But underneath these formal structures, the reality of power had already shifted. Influence was no longer evenly distributed. It was concentrated in networks, alliances between military commanders, wealthy financiers, and political families who understood how to operate across institutions rather than within them. Caesar had spent years learning how those networks worked. Now he intended to dominate them. The consulship was the peak of the traditional Roman political system. Two consuls were elected each year to share executive authority, theoretically balancing power and preventing domination by any single individual. In theory, it preserved the republic's foundational principle, shared governance. In practice, it had become another arena for competition between elite factions. And Caesar entered that competition with a strategy that was already becoming characteristic of him. He did not compete only within the system. He reshaped the conditions of competition itself. By this point, Caesar's reputation in Rome was divided. Among the populace and many urban citizens, he was seen as a rising figure who understood popular needs, someone willing to invest personal wealth into public spectacle, infrastructure, and generosity. Among the conservative optimates, he was viewed with suspicion. Too ambitious, too willing to bypass tradition, too closely aligned with populist pressure. But neither group fully grasped what Caesar was doing. He was not aligning himself permanently with either side. He was positioning himself between them, exploiting both, and refusing to be contained by either category. To reach the consulship, Caesar needed more than popularity or rhetoric. He needed support from men who already held decisive influence. In Rome, this meant alliances with figures whose power extended beyond the city itself, men with military command, financial reach, and political leverage across multiple spheres. The most important of these figures were Pompey and Crassus. Pompey, already a celebrated general, held enormous prestige due to his military victories and his reputation among the people. Crassus, on the other hand, represented financial power on an unprecedented scale, controlling vast wealth that could be used to influence elections, fund campaigns, and secure political outcomes. These two men were rivals. Their interests did not naturally align, and that division created instability within Rome's elite structure. Caesar saw the opportunity immediately. Rather than aligning fully with one side, he positioned himself as a bridge between them, a figure who could translate mutual interest into coordinated action. This was not ideology. It was structural engineering of power. The result was an informal but highly consequential political arrangement that later historians would call the First Triumvirate. It was not a formal institution. There was no law establishing it, no official title, no public declaration. It existed entirely through mutual agreement and shared advantage. And that was precisely what made it effective, because it bypassed the Senate entirely. Through this alliance, Caesar secured the support needed to reach the consulship. But once in office, he did not behave like a conventional consul constrained by institutional expectations. He acted decisively, sometimes aggressively, and often in ways that forced the Senate to react rather than initiate. He introduced reforms aimed at redistributing land to veterans and citizens, a policy that directly challenged entrenched elite interests. He used popular assemblies to bypass Senate resistance, ensuring that legislation could be passed even when aristocratic factions opposed it. This was a shift in method. The Republic had traditionally operated through deliberation. Caesar began operating through momentum. When opposition emerged, he did not pause. He increased pressure. When resistance intensified, he expanded alliances. And when institutional pathways were blocked, he moved through alternative ones. This approach created immediate political tension. To his supporters, it demonstrated effectiveness and responsiveness. To his opponents, it signaled dangerous erosion of traditional constraints. But Caesar was not operating blindly. He was testing limits, seeing how far institutional resistance could be pushed before it broke or adapted. At the same time, the alliance with Pompey and Crassus deepened Caesar's position significantly. It gave him access not only to political support, but to military and financial backing that extended beyond Rome itself. And in a system where military authority increasingly determined political outcomes, this was critical. Because Rome was no longer a purely civic republic. It was becoming a military-political hybrid. And Caesar was positioning himself at the center of that transformation. But every expansion of power produces counterpressure. And in Rome, that pressure was building within the Senate, especially among those who believed that Caesar's methods were not simply unconventional, but fundamentally incompatible with the republic's structure. They did not yet act openly, but they began to observe more closely, coordinate more quietly, and prepare more deliberately. Because Caesar's rise had stopped looking temporary, it was starting to look structural. And structures that cannot be controlled through politics often generate a different response, one that does not come through debate or law, but through removal, unspoken and irreversible. And Caesar, focused on expansion, reform, and alliance building, was moving steadily toward a confrontation he did not yet treat as inevitable. But in Rome's political system, inevitability was rarely recognized before it arrived. By the time Julius Caesar left his consulship behind, Rome was no longer operating under the illusion that its political conflicts were contained within institutions alone. What had once been a system of shared governance had begun to function like a battlefield of overlapping power centers, each with its own resources, loyalties, and ambitions. And Caesar had positioned himself in a way that made him central to all of them. The arrangement that would later be called the First Triumvirate was not born from ideology. It was born from necessity. Pompey had returned from the East with immense military prestige, but faced resistance in the Senate when attempting to secure land for his veterans. Crassus, despite his vast wealth, struggled to translate financial power into consistent political dominance. Caesar, meanwhile, needed backing strong enough to bypass the Senate's conservative obstruction and secure long-term political authority. Individually, each man faced limits. Together, they removed them. This alliance was not formalized in law. It had no constitutional basis. It was not a magistracy or an office. It was something more dangerous, a private alignment of public power. And because it operated outside institutional visibility, it was difficult for the Senate to directly confront. The triumvirate functioned through mutual reinforcement. Caesar provided political strategy and public momentum. Pompey provided military legitimacy and veteran loyalty. Crassus provided financial leverage capable of influencing elections, legislation, and patronage networks. It was not balanced in a moral sense. It was balanced in a practical sense. Each man held something the others needed. And as long as that remained true, the alliance held. But Rome itself was not stable enough to accommodate such concentrated coordination without reaction. Because every system produces resistance when power becomes too concentrated outside its formal structure. Within the Senate, alarm grew slowly at first, then steadily, then urgently, not because Caesar alone had become dominant, but because Caesar represented something more unsettling, a method of operating that bypassed traditional constraints entirely. He did not openly destroy the Republic's institutions. He simply made them less relevant to decision-making. Legislation that faced Senate resistance could be redirected through popular assemblies. Opposition could be countered through alliances. Political blockages could be bypassed through coordinated influence. In effect, Caesar was demonstrating that institutional resistance could be outmaneuvered rather than confronted. And that realization spread quickly, because once a method is proven effective, it is no longer unique. It becomes replicable. Caesar's next major assignment would further accelerate this transformation. He was given command of provinces in Gaul. At first glance, this appeared to be a conventional governorship, an opportunity to secure Rome's borders and manage regional stability. But Caesar understood something deeper. Military command in the provinces was not a retirement from politics. It was an extension of it. And Gaul was not a passive territory. It was fragmented, volatile, and full of competing tribal structures that could be engaged, divided, or unified, depending on strategy. For Caesar, this was not simply a posting. It was a system waiting to be shaped. And critically, it came with legions, armies that would serve under his command for years. Armies that would not just follow orders, but develop loyalty. This is where Rome's transformation becomes irreversible. Because once soldiers begin to identify more strongly with their commander than with the state itself, political authority begins to shift from institutions to individuals. And Caesar, more than anyone in Rome at that time, understood the long-term implications of that shift. While in Gaul, he began building something unprecedented in Roman history. A military force that was not only disciplined, but personally loyal. Campaigns in Gaul were not simple border skirmishes. They were large-scale operations involving movement across vast territories, coordination of supply lines, and engagement with highly diverse tribal coalitions. Caesar adapted quickly. He did not rely solely on traditional Roman tactics. He adjusted, engineered, improvised, and most importantly, he led from the front. This mattered because leadership visibility in military campaigns created emotional and psychological bonds between commander and soldier that could not be replicated through administrative command alone. His soldiers began to see him not just as a general, but as the reason they were succeeding. As victories accumulated, so did Caesar's reputation. Not just in Gaul, but back in Rome. Reports of his campaigns spread widely, often written or influenced by Caesar himself in carefully constructed narratives that emphasized discipline, order, and justified expansion. He was not just winning wars. He was controlling the story of those wars. And in Rome, narrative was power. But while Caesar's influence expanded outward, political conditions in Rome itself were shifting in a different direction. The triumvirate, though still functional, was beginning to strain. Crassus sought military glory to match his financial dominance. Pompey's relationship with the Senate became increasingly complex as he was drawn closer to conservative factions. And Caesar, far from Rome, was building something that neither of them could easily control anymore. An independent power base, one that combined military success, public popularity, and long-term loyalty from armed forces. From the perspective of the Senate, this was becoming increasingly alarming, because it suggested not just influence, but autonomy. And in a republic already strained by internal competition, autonomy of this scale was no longer seen as a normal outcome of political success. It was seen as a threat. And as Caesar's campaigns continued to expand, so too did the distance between him and the political center of Rome. Not just geographically, but structurally. He was no longer simply operating within the republic. He was beginning to operate alongside it. And that distinction would eventually determine everything that followed. when Julius Caesar entered Gaul, it did not appear at first to be the beginning of an empire-defining transformation. To Rome, it was just another province on the edge of control. To Caesar, it was something far more dangerous and far more useful. Because Gaul was not a single unified land. It was a fractured world of tribes, rival kings, shifting alliances, and constant local wars. There was no central authority strong enough to stabilize it, but there was enough organization to make it unpredictable. And unpredictability, in Caesar's mind, was not a weakness. It was an opening. The first conflicts began under the justification of security. Tribes were moving, alliances were shifting. Some groups requested Roman support against others. Caesar responded, as Roman governors often did, with intervention. But what distinguished Caesar was not that he intervened. It was how he expanded intervention into strategy. Each conflict became an entry point. Each alliance became leverage. Each victory became a foundation for the next move. In Rome, wars were often seen as discrete events, campaigns with clear beginnings and ends. Caesar did not see them that way. He saw them as chains. One conflict leading into another, each reshaping the conditions of the next. His first major engagement against the Helvetii was framed as a defensive necessity. A migrating tribe threatened regional stability and Roman allies. Caesar responded with force, defeating them decisively. But what mattered more than the victory was the precedent. Rome was now actively shaping Gaul's internal balance, not merely defending borders. That shift changed everything. Because once a state begins deciding internal outcomes of external regions, it stops being purely defensive. It becomes expansionist by function. Soon after, Caesar confronted Germanic forces led by Ariovistus. Again, the conflict was framed as stabilization. Again, Rome intervened. And again, Caesar emerged victorious. But with each victory, something else was happening. His army was changing. Roman legions were no longer simply rotating citizens, fulfilling temporary service obligations. They were becoming long-term professional forces under continuous command. And that continuity created something critical. Loyalty, not to the Senate, not to Rome as an abstract institution, but to Caesar himself. Because soldiers do not develop loyalty to distant institutions they rarely interact with. They develop loyalty to the man who leads them into battle, feeds them, rewards them, survives with them. Caesar understood this dynamic instinctively, so he reinforced it. He shared hardship with his troops. He maintained presence on the battlefield. He ensured that success translated into tangible reward. And as campaigns continued, the psychological bond between commander and army deepened. At the same time, the scale of operations expanded. Caesar was no longer fighting isolated engagements. He was conducting sustained campaigns across vast territories, building fortifications, bridging rivers, and projecting Roman power into regions that had never previously experienced structured Roman military presence. This required not just military skill, but engineering capability, logistical planning, and rapid adaptation. Caesar excelled in all three. One of the most striking examples of this adaptability came when he constructed a bridge across the Rhine River in a matter of days. This was not just a technical achievement. It was a message. Rome could not only enter Gaul, it could cross beyond it and return. Similarly, his expeditions across the English Channel into Britain were less about long-term occupation and more about demonstration. They showed that even regions beyond continental Europe were within Rome's reach. Each action expanded perception. And in Roman politics, perception was as important as territory. But while Caesar was expanding Rome's boundaries outward, something else was happening inwardly. The political equilibrium in Rome was beginning to shift. The first triumvirate, which had once balanced competing ambitions, was now under strain. Crassus sought military glory in the east and eventually met his end in the Parthian campaign, removing one of the three stabilizing pillars. Pompey, increasingly aligned with Senate conservatives, began to position himself not as Caesar's ally, but as a counterweight to him. And Caesar, far away in Gaul, was becoming something unprecedented. A general with a loyal army operating independently of direct Senate control. From the Senate's perspective, this was not just unusual. It was destabilizing, because it broke an unspoken rule that had governed Roman politics for generations. No single man should control a professional army and a political base simultaneously without institutional oversight. Caesar was now doing exactly that. But more importantly, he was doing it successfully. And success, in Rome, changes perception faster than legality. As Caesar's campaigns continued, reports filtered back to Rome. They were not neutral descriptions of events. They were carefully structured accounts that emphasized order, discipline, and justification. Caesar was not just fighting wars. He was writing how those wars would be remembered. And memory, in politics, becomes legitimacy over time. Back in Rome, concern was growing. What had once been seen as a distant military assignment was now being interpreted as a long-term concentration of power. Some senators began to ask not whether Caesar was successful, but whether he could be recalled at all. Because recalling a general who commands loyalty from tens of thousands of soldiers is not a simple administrative act. It is a political gamble. And Rome was approaching the point where that gamble would define its future. Caesar, meanwhile, continued operating as if his position was secure, structured, and sustainable within the Republic's framework. But the reality was shifting faster than the framework could adapt. And the distance between Caesar and Rome was no longer just physical. It was becoming constitutional. And once that distance becomes structural, the system stops containing power and starts reacting to it. By the later stages of Caesar's Gallic campaigns, something fundamental had changed in the nature of the conflict. What had begun as a series of provincial interventions had evolved into a full-scale transformation of both Gaul and Caesar himself. The land was no longer just a frontier. It was a proving ground. And Caesar was no longer just a governor carrying out Rome's instructions. He had become the defining force in the region. But success has a way of changing the shape of opposition. In Gaul, resistance did not disappear. It adapted. Tribes that had once fought independently began to recognize that Rome's expansion could only be countered through coordination. From this realization emerged larger coalitions, temporary alliances between groups that had historically been rivals. The most significant of these coalitions would eventually form under a single leader, Vercingetorix. He was not the first to resist Rome, but he was the first in Gaul to attempt something new: unification. Instead of scattered resistance, he sought coordinated strategy. Instead of reactive warfare, he pursued planned engagement. And instead of defending individual tribal territories, he adopted a broader vision of expelling Roman influence entirely. This marked a shift, because Caesar was no longer fighting isolated opponents. He was facing an emerging political military identity within Gaul itself. And that made the conflict more than military. It made it ideological in structure, even if not in language. Caesar responded with characteristic speed. When he encountered the early stages of unified resistance, he did not hesitate or consolidate defensively. He moved quickly, striking at key points before coordination could fully stabilize. His strategy was not simply to defeat armies. It was to disrupt organization. Because Caesar understood something critical. In asymmetric conflict, structure is more important than size. If you break coordination, numbers lose meaning. This principle guided his actions across multiple engagements. He used forced marches to outpace expectations. He struck supply lines to destabilize cohesion. He built fortifications not just for defense, but for psychological pressure, forcing enemies to respond to his movements rather than initiate their own. But Vercingetorix's strategy created new pressure. He avoided direct, large-scale confrontation when possible, instead targeting supply routes and attempting to deny Caesar's forces access to resources. This introduced a different kind of war. Not just battle versus battle, but endurance versus endurance. The conflict became about sustainability. Who could maintain cohesion longer under pressure? Who could adapt faster? Who could endure deprivation without collapse? And in this environment, Caesar's leadership style became even more central. Because Roman soldiers under his command were not just fighting for Rome in an abstract sense. They were fighting within a continuous relationship of command, reward, and shared experience. Caesar was present, visible, engaged, and this presence mattered deeply in prolonged campaigns where uncertainty could erode morale. Then came the defining moment of the Gallic Wars, the siege of Alesia. Vercingetorix had withdrawn into a fortified position, forcing Caesar into a siege situation that was strategically complex and potentially dangerous. Because siege warfare reverses many advantages of mobile command. It forces the attacker into stagnation. It creates supply strain. And it invites external relief forces. Caesar understood this immediately. So instead of simply surrounding the settlement, he constructed a dual-layer fortification system. One facing inward, one facing outward. The inner ring contained Vercingetorix. The outer ring prepared for incoming relief forces. This was not just engineering. It was strategic anticipation made physical. When relief forces arrived, Caesar's army was now engaged on two fronts simultaneously. Inside the siege, pressure mounted. Outside the siege, attacks intensified. And between them stood Roman fortifications designed not just to hold ground, but to shape movement itself. The fighting was not a single decisive clash. It was a sustained collapse of coordination across multiple points of pressure. Eventually, the relief forces failed to break through. The internal resistance within Alesia weakened under starvation and exhaustion. And Vercingetorix, recognizing the inevitability of defeat, surrendered. This moment marked the effective end of large-scale organized Gallic resistance. But its significance extended far beyond military victory. Because Caesar had now achieved something no Roman general before him had fully accomplished in this region. He had not only defeated Gaul, he had reorganized it under Roman influence. And in doing so, he had also completed a transformation in himself. He was no longer simply a commander operating under Senate authority. He was now the most powerful military figure in the Roman world, with an army loyal primarily to him, with a reputation that extended across Rome's political sphere, and with a structural position that no longer fit neatly within republican norms. And that is where the real tension began. Because success in Gaul did not bring Caesar closer to Rome's political acceptance. It pushed him further away from it. Back in Rome, the Senate did not interpret his victories purely as Roman success. They interpreted them as personal accumulation of power. The scale of his command, the loyalty of his army, the duration of his authority. All of it now appeared increasingly incompatible with traditional republican balance. And so a new question emerged in Roman politics. Not whether Caesar had been successful, but whether he could ever return without fundamentally altering the state itself. And that question would soon become urgent, because Caesar's command was approaching its end. And when a man who commands an army like his returns to a political system that no longer trusts him, the result is rarely negotiation. It is confrontation, as Caesar's final years in Gaul drew to a close. Rome was no longer watching him as a distant governor completing a military assignment. It was watching him as a question it could not answer cleanly. What do you do with a man who has become too successful to ignore, but too powerful to safely disarm? Because that was now the reality of Caesar's position. He had spent nearly a decade in Gaul. In that time, he had expanded Roman territory, subdued resistance, built infrastructure, and created a military force whose experience was unmatched in the Republic. But more importantly than any single achievement, he had created continuity. His army had fought under his command long enough to develop identity. Not just discipline, not just training, identity. They no longer saw themselves as temporary citizen soldiers rotating back into civilian life. They saw themselves as Caesar's men. And that distinction was everything. Back in Rome, political tensions were no longer subtle. They were structural. The Senate was increasingly divided between those who feared Caesar's return with an army intact and those who believed he could be politically managed within republican norms. But both groups were operating on an assumption that was slowly becoming outdated. That Caesar would return as a private citizen first and a general second. That assumption was incorrect. Caesar had no intention of returning without the political protections that matched his military reality. Because he understood something fundamental about Rome. A man who returns with an army but without legal protection is not entering politics. He is entering vulnerability. So as his governorship neared its conclusion, Caesar made a request that was simple in wording but radical in implication. He sought to retain his command while standing for election to the consulship. In other words, he wanted to remain legally immune while also transitioning into Rome's highest political office. To his supporters, this was reasonable. To his opponents, it was unacceptable, because it broke an unspoken boundary. That military command and political office should not overlap indefinitely in a single individual. The Senate demanded that Caesar disband his army before entering Rome. Caesar refused, and in that refusal, the conflict stopped being procedural. It became existential. At the same time, alliances that had once stabilized Roman politics had already fractured. Crassus was dead. Pompey, once Caesar's closest political partner, had moved increasingly toward the Senate's conservative faction. Their relationship had shifted from cooperation to competition, then to suspicion, then to alignment with opposing interests. Pompey was now positioned not as Caesar's ally, but as the Senate's primary military counterbalance. And that created a new reality. Rome now had two dominant military political figures, each with legitimacy, each with support, each with armies capable of enforcing their position. And between them stood a republic that could no longer mediate their conflict effectively. The system that had once balanced competing ambitions was now being overwhelmed by them. Caesar, still in Gaul, watched the political situation in Rome deteriorate into escalating demands. He was ordered to relinquish command, then to return without his army, then to face potential prosecution depending on how he re-entered political life. From his perspective, these were not neutral legal instructions. They were escalating constraints designed to strip him of leverage before he re-entered the city. And Caesar understood the implication clearly. If he complied fully, he would lose the one asset that guaranteed his survival in Roman politics: his army. So he paused and evaluated. Because at this stage, every possible path forward carried consequences that were no longer reversible. If he disbanded his army, he returned politically exposed. If he kept it, he defied the Senate. If he delayed, he increased suspicion. If he acted aggressively, he triggered conflict. There was no safe option left, only degrees of risk. And in that environment, Caesar made a decision that would redefine Roman history. He would not return as a disarmed governor. He would not submit to political vulnerability. He would return on his own terms, with his army intact, and with full awareness of what that meant. Because the boundary between Gaul and Italy was not just geographical. It was legal. A general was forbidden from bringing an army into Italy proper. That rule existed to prevent exactly this kind of scenario. But rules only function when they are enforced. And enforcement depends on control. Caesar now stood at that boundary. And in that moment, Rome's political system reached its breaking point. Because everything depended on what he would do next. Remain outside and negotiate. Disband and trust the Senate. Or cross the line and transform political conflict into something else entirely. And Caesar, after years of calculation, war, and political maneuvering, chose the third path, not because it was safe, but because it was the only path that preserved agency. And once that decision was made, Rome was no longer in a political dispute. It was in a civil war waiting to begin. The river was small, almost unimpressive. A narrow stretch of water cutting through the northern edge of Italy, barely wide enough to matter in a geographical sense. And yet, standing at its edge, Julius Caesar was looking at something far larger than geography. He was looking at a boundary that existed in law, in tradition, and in the invisible architecture of Roman political identity. On one side of that river lay Gaul, his province, his command, his legal authority as proconsul. On the other side lay Italy. And Italy was not just land. Italy was Rome itself, the heart of political legitimacy, the center of republican law, the place where a Roman general was forbidden to bring an army under arms. That rule was not symbolic. It was structural. It existed for one reason: to prevent military commanders from turning their legions inward against the state. And now Caesar stood at that boundary with an army that no longer functioned as a temporary provincial force. It functioned as a permanent extension of his command. Men who had fought for him in Gaul. Men who had survived sieges, marches, winters, starvation, and victories that had reshaped the map of Western Europe. They were not just soldiers anymore. They were Caesar's identity made physical. Behind him stretched nearly a decade of campaigns. A decade of expansion. A decade of building something Rome had never fully experienced before. A commander whose army had followed him long enough to stop feeling like a borrowed instrument of the state. And that was the problem. Because Rome had built its entire political system on one assumption: No man should ever hold a permanent army loyal to him alone inside the political center of the Republic. But Caesar was no longer operating inside that assumption. He had reached a point where returning to Rome without protection was not neutrality. It was vulnerability. Because the political situation in Rome had changed dramatically during his absence. His enemies in the Senate had consolidated influence. Legal threats were being prepared against him. Political protections were being stripped away. And the request placed before him was no longer simple governance. It was surrender disguised as legality. He was ordered to disband his army, return as a private citizen, and face potential prosecution under hostile political conditions. To the Senate, this was lawful procedure. To Caesar, it was something else entirely. It was the removal of all leverage before entering a political environment controlled by opponents who had already demonstrated willingness to act against him. And Caesar understood something that many in Rome still did not fully grasp. In politics, timing determines safety more than legality does. A man without protection does not enter justice. He enters exposure. So he stopped at the river, and the silence around him was not empty, it was loaded with consequence. Every soldier behind him understood what this moment meant, even if no formal announcement had been made. They had been following Caesar long enough to recognize the structure of decisions before they were spoken aloud. This was not a routine halt. This was a threshold. And Caesar was the only man who could decide what came next. In Roman tradition, this was not just a military decision. It was a constitutional rupture point. Because once a general crossed the Rubicon with an army, the distinction between civil authority and military force collapsed. The Republic no longer treated that act as a disagreement. It treated it as internal war. Caesar knew this fully. He was not stepping into uncertainty. He was stepping into irreversible consequence. And yet the decision was not impulsive. It was the end point of a long chain of narrowing options. Every negotiation had reduced his choices. Every political demand had tightened the framework around him. Every ultimatum had eliminated a neutral path. Now there were only two outcomes left: submit and lose control of his political survival, or act and redefine the structure entirely. And Caesar had never been a man who chose passive survival over active control. He looked across the river, not as a man hesitating, but as a man calculating what the system would become after the next action. And then he spoke the words that would echo through centuries. The die is cast. Then he crossed. The moment itself was not dramatic in physical terms. No explosion. No visible collapse of the world. Just a movement forward. But in structural terms, everything changed instantly. Because the moment Caesar crossed the Rubicon, the Roman Republic stopped being a system of managed political competition and became a system of internal conflict. News traveled faster than formal declarations. In Rome, the reaction was immediate. Confusion first, then shock, then acceleration of political crisis. The Senate convened emergency sessions. Debates collapsed into urgent alignment decisions. And one truth became unavoidable. Caesar was no longer a governor returning home. He was a commander entering Rome with an army. And that meant the Republic was now facing a situation it had not experienced in generations. Not external war, but internal fracture at the highest level of command authority. Pompey, once Caesar's ally, now emerged as the primary military counterweight. But even he recognized the difficulty of the situation immediately. Defending Rome itself against Caesar's rapid advance was not strategically viable. The political center was exposed. The military structure was not prepared for internal confrontation of this scale. And so Pompey made a decision that would define the next phase of the war. He withdrew, not in defeat, but in repositioning. Rome itself was abandoned as a battlefield. The conflict would be decided elsewhere. And with that decision, the civil war stopped being localized. It became Mediterranean in scale. Because Pompey did not retreat alone. He carried Senate legitimacy with him. He carried allied provinces. He carried resources and naval power from the east. And suddenly, the Roman world split into two moving centers of authority. Caesar controlled Italy. Pompey controlled the eastern provinces. And between them stretched everything Rome had built over centuries. What followed was not immediate confrontation. It was strategic repositioning. Caesar moved fast, faster than most political systems can respond. He did not pause to consolidate symbolic authority. He did not wait for full Senate recognition. He acted because he understood that in civil war, hesitation is equivalent to loss of initiative. He secured Italy quickly. He stabilized internal political structures. He ensured that opposition inside Rome did not coalesce into immediate resistance. And then he turned outward. Because Pompey was not static. He was assembling something larger in the east. And that would become the next stage of the conflict. A war not just over Rome, but over the definition of Rome itself. When Caesar secured Italy, it did not feel like the end of a campaign. It felt like the opening of something far larger. Because taking control of the Italian peninsula was not the same as controlling Rome's political system. It only meant that the center of gravity had shifted. The real power of the Republic was no longer concentrated in a single city-state structure. It was distributed across provinces, armies, financial networks, and allied kingdoms stretching from Hispania to Syria, from North Africa to Greece and Asia Minor. And now that entire structure had fractured into competing interpretations of legitimacy. On one side stood Julius Caesar, a commander who had crossed the Rubicon, secured Italy with speed and precision, and now commanded the loyalty of battle-hardened legions who had followed him for nearly a decade. On the other side stood Pompey, once Caesar's political ally, now transformed into the Republic's primary military symbol of opposition, carrying with him the authority of the Senate and the allegiance of eastern provinces. But this was no longer a simple rivalry. It was a structural split in Roman identity, because both sides claimed to represent Rome, and both sides were now capable of acting like Rome. That is what made the situation so unstable. A civil war is not only defined by violence, it is defined by competing legitimacy. And Rome had never fully prepared for a situation where legitimacy itself became divisible. Pompey's strategy was immediate and deliberate. He did not attempt to defend Italy. He abandoned it. This decision was not weakness, it was calculation. He understood that Caesar's speed and veteran legions made Italy difficult to hold in the short term. Instead, Pompey chose to preserve strength, consolidate resources, and rebuild authority in the east, where he already had established influence over provinces, client kingdoms, and naval forces. In doing so, he transformed the civil war into something new. A Mediterranean conflict spanning multiple power centers. Rome was no longer the battlefield. It was the symbol both sides claimed. Caesar, meanwhile, did not hesitate. He moved quickly through Italy, not as a destroyer of cities, but as a consolidator of political control. Towns either aligned with him or negotiated terms. Resistance was sporadic, disorganized, and often hesitant. Because many communities were not yet sure what this war truly represented. Was Caesar a rebel? Was Pompey defending tradition? Was the Senate still functioning as the legitimate center of authority? Or had legitimacy already shifted to whoever controlled military force? That uncertainty created paralysis in many regions. And Caesar used that paralysis strategically. Speed was not just tactical, it was psychological. Every rapid movement reinforced the perception that resistance was already behind the curve of events. But Caesar's true objective was not Italy alone. Italy was only the foundation. The real confrontation lay beyond it. Because Pompey was not attempting to rebuild resistance within Rome's traditional boundaries. He was assembling a trans-regional coalition. In Greece, Macedonia, Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt, Pompey's influence stretched through a network of governors, allies, and client rulers who still recognized Senate legitimacy as the formal center of Roman authority. This meant that the civil war had become a competition over the imperial structure itself. Not just control of Rome, but control of Rome's world. And that changed everything. Because now resources, armies, and political authority were no longer centralized. They were distributed across geography. Caesar recognized this immediately. He did not attempt to consolidate Italy into a long-term defensive position. Instead, he followed Pompey's strategic logic outward. Because in civil war, the side that remains static loses initiative. So Caesar moved. First, to secure Spain, where Pompeian forces held strong regional command structures. This campaign was not just about defeating armies. It was about dismantling the backbone of Pompey's logistical support system. Spain represented recruitment, taxation, and military depth. By removing it, Caesar reduced Pompey's long-term capacity to sustain large-scale resistance. The campaign was swift, efficient, structurally decisive. And when it ended, Caesar did not linger. He returned briefly to Italy, not to rest, but to stabilize internal governance and prepare for the next phase. Because by this point, the civil war had entered a new stage. The pursuit phase. Pompey had retreated east, and Caesar now followed. But what awaited him in the east was not a fragmented opponent. It was a coalition. Pompey had gathered senators who fled Rome, allied kingdoms who saw opportunity in Roman instability, and provincial forces aligned under the promise of restoring republican authority. On paper, this coalition appeared stronger than Caesar's forces. It had more ships, more territory, more regional diversity. But it had one critical weakness. It was not unified under a single operational identity. Caesar's army, by contrast, was unified through shared experience. Years of campaigns had created cohesion that could not be replicated through rapid alliance building. This difference would become decisive later. But before that confrontation, another transformation was occurring within Caesar himself. Because as he moved deeper into Mediterranean politics, his role was no longer just military. It was geopolitical. He was not simply defeating armies. He was reorganizing the structure of Roman influence across continents. Every region he entered became part of a larger systemic shift. And that shift was accelerating beyond the original boundaries of the Civil War. At this stage, Rome itself was no longer the center of action. It was one node among many. And that meant The Republic was no longer a single governing system. It was a contested network of competing authorities. Caesar understood that the next major engagement would not just determine military victory. It would determine which version of Rome would define the future. The traditional Senate-led republic, or a centralized system anchored in military command and executive authority. And Pompey, in Greece, was preparing for that confrontation, gathering forces, aligning resources, waiting for Caesar to arrive. The stage was no longer Italy. It was the entire Eastern Mediterranean. And both men now understood the stakes clearly. This was no longer a political rivalry. It was a structural decision point for Rome's future. And once armies began moving toward each other in that theater, there would be no return to the previous political world. Pompey's flight into the East did not end the war. It expanded it. Because once the conflict left Italy, it stopped being a struggle over the political center of Rome and became something far more complex, a struggle over Rome's entire imperial system. In Greece, Pompey gathered what remained of Senate-aligned authority. Senators who had fled Rome after Caesar's advance now regrouped around him. Eastern provinces, client kingdoms, and naval resources were drawn into his orbit. On paper, this looked like strength. In reality, it was fragmentation held together by urgency. Different commanders, different expectations, different interpretations of what restoring the Republic even meant in practice. And that was the hidden weakness. Because coalitions built in crisis rarely develop unified identity. They develop shared fear. Caesar, meanwhile, moved methodically through Italy and then outward, stabilizing regions and preparing for direct confrontation. But the war did not proceed in a straight line, because Pompey did not remain stationary in Greece. He began assembling a broader eastern base of operations, extending influence into regions where Rome's authority was layered, negotiated, and often dependent on local rulers. And that expansion of geography introduced new variables into the civil war. Because now the conflict was not only Roman versus Roman. It was Roman versus Roman influence across multiple political systems. And one of those systems was Egypt. Egypt was not just another kingdom on the map. It was one of the wealthiest, most strategically important regions in the Mediterranean world. Its grain supplies fed large portions of Rome's population. Its ports connected trade routes across Africa and the Near East. Its internal politics, though governed by the Ptolemaic dynasty, were deeply entangled with Roman interests. And at the center of Egypt's internal instability stood two figures, Cleopatra VII and her brother Ptolemy XIII. Their co-rule was not stable cooperation. It was controlled tension, a dynastic structure held together by court factions, competing advisors, and external influences that constantly shifted the balance of power. When Pompey fled after his defeat at Pharsalus, Egypt became his intended refuge. But he miscalculated something critical. Egypt was not neutral ground. It was politically unstable ground. And instability does not guarantee safety. It guarantees unpredictability. As Pompey approached Egypt seeking asylum, the court surrounding Ptolemy XIII faced a difficult decision. Supporting Pompey risked drawing Caesar's attention. Rejecting him risked alienating a powerful Roman figure. But ultimately, they chose what they believed was the safest option. They eliminated him. Pompey was killed shortly after arriving in Egypt. Not in battle, not in Rome, but in a political execution designed to avoid Roman retaliation. It failed because Caesar arrived shortly after. And instead of diffusing tension Pompey's death escalated it. When Caesar entered Egypt, he did not arrive as a neutral observer of local politics. He arrived as the surviving central figure of a collapsing civil war. And Egypt, already unstable, became a stage for another power crisis. Alexandria, one of the most advanced cities in the ancient world, became the focal point of this confrontation. Not because it was strategically chosen, but because political pressure forced all key actors into the same confined space. Ptolemy XIII's faction attempted to assert control over Caesar's presence in the city. Cleopatra, recognizing the danger of being excluded from Roman decision-making, sought direct access to Caesar. The method she used was not symbolic. It was strategic. She bypassed hostile court control and arranged to meet Caesar directly, establishing immediate presence at the center of Roman authority in Egypt. What followed was not a simple alliance. It was alignment of interests under conditions of instability. Caesar needed order in Egypt. Cleopatra needed support in a dynastic struggle that threatened her position. Their cooperation emerged from necessity, not sentiment. But in political systems, necessity often becomes the foundation of long-term structural alignment. As tensions escalated, Alexandria became a battlefield. Roman forces under Caesar found themselves engaged in urban warfare within one of the most densely populated and architecturally complex cities of the ancient world. Street control shifted block by block. Harbor access became critical. Supply lines were contested within the city itself. And Caesar, now operating far from traditional Roman battlefields, had to adapt his command style to an environment where conventional legions were forced into close-quarter, unpredictable combat scenarios. At times, Caesar's position became precarious. Isolated segments of his forces were cut off. Communication lines were strained. Reinforcements were uncertain. But Caesar did not abandon control. He adapted continuously. And eventually, Roman reinforcements arrived, tipping the balance of the conflict in his favor. Ptolemy XIII's forces collapsed. Cleopatra was restored as ruler. But more importantly, Egypt was now politically aligned with Caesar's influence. Not as a formal Roman province, but as a strategically integrated kingdom whose leadership was directly connected to Roman authority. And Cleopatra herself became a critical political actor within that structure. Her relationship with Caesar, both personal and political, has been heavily mythologized over centuries. But at its core, it was grounded in strategic alignment. Rome controlled military power. Egypt controlled resources and regional stability. Together, they created a convergence point of Mediterranean influence. Cleopatra's position was strengthened, but also structurally linked to Roman outcomes. And Caesar, after stabilizing Egypt, did not remain there. Because the civil war in Rome was not finished. It had only shifted theaters. Pompey was dead, but his supporters were still active. His political coalition had not fully dissolved, and new resistance forces were forming in the eastern provinces. Caesar now moved rapidly again, defeating remaining opposition forces in Asia Minor with such speed that he reportedly summarized the campaign with a simple phrase: "I came, I saw, I conquered." But behind that phrase was something deeper. A shift in how wars were being conducted. Caesar was no longer fighting isolated battles. He was resolving systemic instability across interconnected regions. Each victory did not end conflict. It reduced complexity. And in doing so, he was steadily reconstructing the Roman world around a single axis of authority: his own. And that reconstruction would soon bring him back to Rome, where the final political transformation of the Republic had not yet fully played out. When Julius Caesar returned to Rome after the Eastern campaigns, he was not returning to a stable political environment. He was returning to a system that had already been permanently altered by his absence, and more importantly, by his success. Rome still functioned on the surface. Senate meetings still took place. Magistrates still held office. Legal structures still existed. But beneath that surface, the Republic no longer operated as a unified system of shared authority. It operated as a collection of shifting power centers that had learned, over years of crisis, that survival depended less on institutional hierarchy and more on alignment with force. And Caesar was now the most concentrated source of force in the Roman world. Not just militarily, but politically, administratively, and symbolically. His return did not feel like the return of a governor completing a campaign cycle. It felt like the arrival of the central variable that would determine the next phase of Roman history. And Rome did not agree on how to interpret that. Some saw Caesar as the man who had ended civil war, the one who had defeated Pompey, stabilized the East, secured Egypt, and restored a fractured Mediterranean system into something resembling order. Others saw him as something far more dangerous, a single individual who had accumulated authority across every major domain of Roman power without relinquishing military command. And in Roman political tradition, that combination was not just unusual. It was structurally alarming, because the Republic was built on rotation, not permanence, on distributed authority, not consolidation. And Caesar was now operating in a space where consolidation had already occurred. Once Caesar entered Rome, he did not dismantle its institutions. He reconfigured them. The Senate still existed, but its composition changed significantly. New members were introduced from Italy and the provinces, many of whom were aligned with Caesar's political network. This reduced the dominance of traditional aristocratic families who had long controlled senatorial decision-making. To Caesar's supporters, this was modernization. To his opponents, it was dilution. But both interpretations missed the deeper structural reality. The Senate was no longer the central decision-making authority. It had become part of a larger system that now revolved around a single executive figure, Caesar himself. He also initiated reforms that addressed long-standing systemic instability in Rome. Debt restructuring, veteran settlement programs, administrative centralization across provinces, calendar reform, legal streamlining. These were not isolated policies. They were attempts to stabilize a system that had been destabilized by decades of civil war and expansion. But stabilization requires legitimacy, and legitimacy in Rome was no longer solely derived from tradition. It was increasingly derived from effectiveness, and Caesar was undeniably effective. As his authority expanded, so did the symbolic recognition of his position. Honors accumulated. Statues were erected. Public decrees elevated his status within Roman civic life. He was granted extraordinary powers, including dictatorship, extended beyond its traditional temporary framework. This was not done in secret. It was voted, formally, publicly, through institutional channels. But the meaning of those votes was shifting, because what was once an emergency mechanism was becoming a governing structure. And that transition was subtle enough that many within the system did not fully recognize its long-term implications while it was happening. Caesar himself did not publicly declare monarchy, but the accumulation of roles, honors, and authority began to create a political environment where his position was no longer comparable to other magistrates. He was not simply first among equals. He was becoming structurally distinct from them. And that distinction created tension within the political elite, especially among those who believed that the Republic depended on the absence of permanent centralized authority. Among them was a group of senators who began to view Caesar's position not as temporary dominance, but as irreversible transformation. Marcus Junius Brutus became one of the most symbolically significant figures in this environment. His identity carried contradictions that reflected the broader tension of Roman elite culture. He was tied to republican ideals, but also personally connected to Caesar. He represented the conflict between institutional loyalty and personal relationship, between tradition and transformation. And that conflict would soon become decisive, because Caesar, operating from his position of consolidated authority, continued to plan long-term campaigns, administrative restructuring, and structural reforms for the empire. He did not appear to view his position as temporary. He appeared to view it as foundational, a base from which Rome's next phase would be organized. But within the Senate, interpretation was shifting, because what one side viewed as stability, the other side increasingly viewed as permanent imbalance. And in Roman political thought, imbalance does not remain unresolved indefinitely. It resolves through correction or removal. And that idea began to take form not as public debate, but as private coordination. A group of senators began to converge on a shared conclusion. Not that Caesar should be debated further, not that he should be politically constrained, but that his position had already surpassed the point where normal republican mechanisms could restore balance. In their view, the system could no longer absorb his authority, which meant the system itself would have to act. And that decision, once reached, did not require broad consensus, only execution. Caesar, meanwhile, continued operating within the assumption that Rome's institutions could still function alongside his authority. He did not significantly alter his daily patterns. He attended meetings, issued directives, engaged in political planning, and prepared for future military campaigns that would expand Rome's influence further east. But beneath that normalcy, the structure around him had already shifted into irreversible tension. Because Rome was no longer a unified political system negotiating internal differences. It was a system holding competing interpretations of legitimacy within the same physical space. And that kind of tension does not stabilize. It accumulates until it reaches a breaking point. And in Caesar's case, that breaking point was already being prepared. By the final months of Caesar's life, Rome was no longer moving toward crisis. It was already inside it. But what made that crisis difficult to recognize in real time was that the Republic still looked intact on the surface. The Senate still met, magistrates still governed, laws were still passed, rituals still performed. From a distance, the system appeared functional. But internally, it had lost its shared agreement on what functioning actually meant. For Caesar's opponents, the central issue had become increasingly fixed. They did not see him as a reformer anymore. They did not see him as a transitional figure. They saw him as a permanent concentration of authority that could no longer be reduced through normal republican mechanisms. And in Roman political logic, when a system cannot correct itself through institutions, correction begins to move outside institutions. Quietly, privately, irreversibly. Marcus Junius Brutus stood at the center of this tension, not because he was the sole architect of opposition, but because he embodied its contradiction. He was tied to republican tradition, aristocratic identity, and the belief that Rome's stability depended on distributed power. But he was also personally connected to Caesar, politically elevated by Caesar, and in many ways shaped by the very system he was now preparing to oppose. That contradiction mattered, because Roman politics was never purely ideological. It was relational, and relational tension often becomes more decisive than abstract principle. Within the Senate, coordination among the conspirators developed gradually, not as a single unified command structure, but as a convergence of separate concerns. Some feared loss of aristocratic influence. Some feared permanent restructuring of governance. Some feared that Caesar's authority would normalize itself into a form of monarchy without declaring itself as such. But they all arrived at a shared conclusion. The system would not return to its previous balance on its own, and therefore intervention was required. Not through debate, not through legal constraint, but through direct removal. The selection of timing was not accidental. They chose a Senate meeting, a controlled environment, a familiar institutional setting. Because the goal was not chaos. It was framed, at least internally, as correction within structure. Caesar would be present as he normally was, surrounded by senators, engaged in procedural governance, and therefore, in their view, the act itself would occur inside the Republic rather than outside it. But political systems rarely interpret internal violence as procedural continuity. They interpret it as rupture. In the days leading up to the meeting, Rome carried an unusual atmosphere. Not open panic, not visible collapse, but a kind of distributed tension that moved through elite circles, rumors, and subtle behavioral shifts. Some advisors reportedly warned Caesar of danger. Some urged him to avoid the Senate. Others suggested caution without clarity. But Caesar's response, according to tradition, reflected a consistent pattern in his political behavior. He did not avoid structured political spaces. He engaged with them, because retreat, in his framework, often created more instability than presence. On the morning of the Ides of March, Caesar entered the Senate chamber as he had many times before. The setting itself was familiar, architecturally stable, procedurally normal. But the internal alignment of participants was no longer neutral. It had been reorganized into coordinated intent. The conspirators positioned themselves carefully within the chamber, not as an external force, but as part of the institutional environment itself. That detail matters, because the entire structure of the act depended on proximity, expectation, and the assumption of normal political interaction. A petition was presented to Caesar, a standard procedural action, something that would not normally signal danger. He turned his attention toward it, and in that moment of procedural focus, the spatial arrangement around him shifted. Gradually, then decisively. What followed was not a spontaneous outbreak of violence. It was coordinated action emerging from concealed alignment. Caesar attempted to respond, but the environment itself had been structured to limit reaction space. The Senate chamber was not a battlefield. It was a confined institutional space where movement, visibility, and proximity all constrained options. And in that environment, multiple participants acted simultaneously. The moment ceased to be political negotiation. It became physical collapse of authority within a space designed for governance. According to later accounts, Caesar recognized Brutus during the attack. That recognition has carried enormous symbolic weight through history, not simply as betrayal, but as the intersection of personal relationship and structural rupture. Whether or not the exact phrasing attributed to Caesar was spoken in that form, the meaning of the moment is consistent. This was not an external enemy. This was internal system breakdown. Caesar fell within the Senate itself. The institution that had defined Roman political life for centuries became the site of its most symbolic rupture. And for a brief moment, the conspirators believed they had achieved their objective. They believed the system would reset. They believed authority would redistribute back into republican balance. They believed Rome would return to its prior equilibrium. But systems do not revert simply because a central figure is removed. They reorganize around new pressures. And Rome, at that moment, had already been structurally changed beyond simple restoration. Because Caesar was not just an individual holding office. He was a convergence point of military loyalty, administrative authority, popular influence, and territorial control. Removing him did not remove those structures. It released them. And what followed was not stabilization. It was acceleration into a new phase of conflict that would determine whether Rome remained a republic in form or became something entirely different in function. And that transformation had already begun. The moment Caesar fell, Rome did not become free. It became uncertain. And uncertainty in Roman political life is not a temporary condition. It is a catalyst. It forces systems that were once held together by shared assumptions to reveal what they actually are underneath. For years, many senators had believed that Caesar's presence was the main distortion in the Republic, that if his authority were removed, the old balance would naturally return. But what they discovered immediately after his death was something far more destabilizing. There was no old balance left to return to. The system had already changed. And Caesar was not the only reason. He was the most visible expression of a deeper transformation. Decades of civil conflict, expansion, military professionalization, and the gradual shift of loyalty from institutions to individuals. So when Caesar was removed, the structure did not reset. It fractured. At first, there was confusion. The conspirators, still inside the Senate chamber, attempted to frame the act as a restoration of republican liberty. They spoke in the language of tradition, law, and civic balance. They believed that by eliminating Caesar, they had removed the threat of permanent centralized authority. But outside the chamber, Rome was already reacting differently. News spread quickly, faster than interpretation, faster than control. And in the streets, the meaning of Caesar's death was not immediately political in the abstract sense. It was personal. Caesar had not only been a political figure. He had been a source of land redistribution, veteran settlement, public games, and direct financial generosity to parts of the population. His will, when it was eventually read, intensified this reaction further. He left monetary gifts to the citizens of Rome. He reinforced public benefit structures. He embedded his memory into material consequence. And that transformed grief into something more volatile. Because now his death was not just a political event. It was an interruption of ongoing benefit. At his funeral, the emotional tension that had been building across the city finally broke into public action. Speeches delivered in his honor did not simply recount his achievements. They amplified collective sentiment, transforming mourning into anger. And that anger did not remain symbolic. It became physical. The conspirators had expected relief. What they encountered instead was reaction. And that reaction was not unified either. Rome did not move as one body. It split into competing responses almost immediately. One centered around the Senate's justification of the assassination as a restoration of liberty. Another centered around Caesar's legacy, framed not as tyranny, but as stability, expansion, and material benefit. And in that division, the Republic stopped functioning as a single interpretive system. It became contested. Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, emerged almost immediately as a key figure in this transition. As consul and close associate of Caesar, he gained access to Caesar's documents and used them to shape public perception. But more importantly, he understood something critical. Caesar's authority did not end with his death. It became an inheritance. And inheritance is a political force. When Caesar's will was made public, it altered the structure of allegiance in Rome even further. His provisions to the people created a direct material link between his legacy and the population. That link ensured that his memory would remain active in political life. Not symbolic, functional. At the same time, another figure entered the political landscape. Octavian, young, relatively unknown at first, but legally adopted by Caesar as his heir. And that fact alone placed him at the center of the unfolding power vacuum. Because in Rome, legal inheritance is not private. It is political positioning. Brutus and Cassius, meanwhile, withdrew from Rome, attempting to consolidate support in the eastern provinces. Their strategy was based on the assumption that Caesar's death would restore institutional control and that they could rebuild republican authority from outside Italy. But they misread the structural reality. Caesar's removal did not restore institutional dominance. It created competing claims to his authority. And those claims were not abstract. They were militarized. Armies began to align. Provinces began to shift. Governors began to choose sides. Rome was no longer a single governing center with internal disagreement. It was becoming multiple centers of authority competing across geography. And that is the key transformation that Caesar's death reveals. He did not simply end his own life. He exposed the Republic's fragmentation into a visible structure. Very quickly, conflict resumed. But this was not a continuation of Caesar versus Pompey. That phase was over. Pompey was dead. This was something different. This was Caesar's legacy splitting into competing successors. Mark Antony representing continuity of Caesar's immediate authority. Octavian representing legal inheritance and future consolidation. Brutus and Cassius representing republican restoration. And behind them all, the wider Roman world adjusting to the reality that no single institutional framework could immediately stabilize control. Over time, Octavian would prove the most politically adaptive of these forces, not through immediate military brilliance alone, but through patience, alliance building, and careful alignment of institutions around his position. He would eventually defeat his rivals, not just militarily, but structurally. And when he emerged victorious, he did not restore the Republic. He transformed it. He became Augustus. And with that transformation, Rome entered a new political era, one that preserved the language and forms of the Republic, but concentrated its authority into a single imperial structure. Looking back, Caesar's life does not end with his assassination. It ends with the realization that his existence marked the transition point, the moment where Rome stopped being a republic in practice, even before it stopped being one in name. He did not destroy the Republic alone. He revealed that it had already evolved beyond the structure it claimed to be. And everything that followed, civil war, succession, empire, was the consequence of that revelation taking shape in real time. Remember, like and subscribe to the channel and comment what topics you would like to see covered in the next video. Until next time.